Hi, I'm Dr. Musil, and welcome to Lecture 13, Virtue Ethics, where we take a look at what Aristotle has to say about morality. So at this point in the course, we finished the first two sections or parts of the course, just concluded the second part or second section where we took a very close look at the other two big moral theories, utilitarianism and then deontology. And then now we're going to turn our focus to, at the beginning of the final part of the course, turn our focus to Aristotle and his virtue ethics, the third of the big three moral theories. So another very, very popular, well-liked, you might say, moral theory that's been very popular since, even Aristotle's time, obviously, since he introduced it. It's actually become so it's sort of with the onset of utilitarianism and deontology became a little less popular for a while, but it's actually even gained a resurgence as of late, and it's always had some degree of popularity, but it's just as popular, I would say, nowadays as it ever has been. At least it seems like to me. So very important moral theory. I went out and grabbed some props here from the library. One of the things I'll mention about Aristotle here in a moment is a very prolific writer. So you can see I just grabbed a few of the things. We'll talk more about Aristotle here in a moment, but as you can see, had a lot to say. So in the second part, I meant to mention, right? So I alluded to in one of the previous videos that we'll start off by surveying what three ancients have to say about, morality, and namely Aristotle, and then we'll talk about the Buddha in lecture 14, and then we'll turn to a segment of Plato's famous The Republic, one of his famous dialogues, and talk about this famous excerpt known as the Ring of Gyges. We'll talk about then what Plato has to say. Plato/Socrates, as we'll see, there's some ambiguity in terms of who we ought to attribute the beliefs that come up in the Republic, who we ought to attribute those to. But at any rate, we're going to be doing a lot with respect to ancient philosophy here in the next few lectures. And then we'll talk a little bit about, we'll revisit the idea of ethical egoism. We talked a little bit about that with respect to Hobbes, but we'll talk about that again when we talk a little bit about Ayn Rand and what she has to say. And then we'll discuss moral relativism. We'll give both a case for it via Ruth Benedict and then a case against it via James Rachels, and that's in lecture 17, I believe. And then we'll conclude the third and final section and thus the course with lecture 18, where we go through the whole semester talking about all these various moral theories, and then Nietzsche is going to come along and say, "Hey, you wasted all that time was wasted because morality doesn't exist." So we'll end with a moral skeptic. But that's the plan for the third part of the course. Again, we're going to start here with Aristotle, lecture 13. We'll actually have two videos here, so two different parts. Here in the first part, we're going to, again, talk about Aristotle, introduce who he is. As we like to do with these moral theories, I like to start off very generally, so we'll try to carve out in a very general sense, what virtue ethics is, and then we'll dive in more detail and talk about the particulars and what Aristotle has to say about various things. For example, what exactly, so it's known as virtue ethics. Well, what exactly is virtue and what does that amount to? We'll also talk about in this first part, this first video, this idea that one of the things that appeals to a lot of people about Aristotle's moral theory, and that's the flexibility it seems to afford. And thus his notion that morality, contrary to what someone like Kant would suggest, and Aquinas and so on, that morality is inexact science, that it's a flexible matter, and that what might be true for me, morally speaking, what might be required, morally speaking, of me, might not be true and required of you. And so that's, a lot of people find that very appealing. At the same time, some people find that then lacking because they want to suggest that he doesn't offer enough guidance. But we'll develop that sort of point about Aristotle and the corresponding criticism as we move along here. And then we'll conclude the first part of the lecture, or the first video, by discussing then his famous golden mean, the idea of, look, while it's, we can't tell you exactly how to behave, it's an inexact science, he doesn't completely leave us hanging. I can tell you that no matter who you are and what your situation is, always shoot for the golden mean. Avoid excess and avoid deficiency. So the idea of moderation, moderation is the key. Much of what we retain and hear, that boils back to the ancients and to Aristotle. That adage, that mentality of moderation being the key. that was born out in Aristotle 2,000 plus years ago, and this idea of the golden mean. So that's what we'll talk about in the first part, or the first video here, and then the second part of lecture 13, we'll talk about some of the practical implications that follow from what Aristotle says and from this moral theory known as virtue ethics. So what are some of the things that follow? And then not only that, as we'll see, one of the ideas is going to be that it's a very difficult process becoming, virtuous and reaching, as we'll see, a state of eudaimonia. I've always called it eudaimonia, and then somebody recently said, well, isn't it eudaimonia? I'm going to say it both ways and probably butcher it 100 million different ways, but right, this is going to be an important sort of feature, right, for Aristotle, but it's going to be difficult to get there, as we'll see. And many of us, try as we might never reach the state of eudaimonia. There, I got it. And so it's a difficult process. So kudos to Aristotle, though. He offers us practical tips, suggestions in terms of how to try to reach that state of persistent flourishing. Okay. He also will talk about how to identify a virtuous character. We see a deed done, presumably a virtuous thing. Little Sammy helping the little lady cross the street. We'll revisit that scenario. And he'll talk about, well, how do we really know that was in fact, that little Sammy does have a virtuous character. So we'll talk about, again, this is in part 2, the second video. We'll talk about then how Aristotle suggests we identify the truly virtuous character, right? Versus, so it's a very Kantian point, as we'll see, that he's going to make. Just because ostensibly it seems like it might have been a virtuous thing to do, was it actually indicative of something he would have routinely done over time? Was it indicative of his character, or was it an anomaly? Is that only how he would have behaved 1 out of 100 times? So he's going to make that sort of point, and suggest these sort of things matter when it comes to identifying whether somebody is truly virtuous or not. And I should point out that we'll see similarities. I mentioned Kant there and how that seems similar to Kant. We'll see similarities with respect to the virtue ethics in Aristotle to the utilitarians, many of which will be in the first part of the video, or the first video. And then, as I mentioned, one way in the second part, the second video, we'll see ways in which Aristotle and his virtue ethics is similar to Kant. And I don't know if I mentioned this already, but actually at this point in the course, a lot of times people they're desperate. Is there anything sort of an intermediary ground? We have these two extremes, utilitarianism and deontology, and they seem so polar opposites and on the extremes. And so a lot of times this does come as a kind of breath of fresh air, a middle ground, if you will, this idea of virtue ethics. And we'll see what you guys think. We'll see what you guys ultimately think of the theory. And, it's certainly different. I think you'll appreciate at the very least that it emphasizes different points, at least, let's put it that way, than the utilitarians, as we saw in the first few lectures of part 2, and then the deontologists, the last few lectures of part 2. Definitely different points of emphasis. He'll also talk, as we'll see in the second part, in the second lecture, talk about how, in what sense, we should deem ourselves responsible from a moral perspective, or in what sense, insofar as we are morally responsible, how is it that we're morally responsible? So he's going to suggest that we should approach the idea of moral responsibility in a certain way. So we'll elaborate on that. And then we'll develop a few more criticisms that people have had with respect to virtue ethics. We'll talk about that at the very end of the second part of the second video. So anyway, let's go back here. Since this is the first part of the first video, let's go ahead and dive back into what we're actually talking about here. And we'll talk about Aristotle. So we'll go ahead and move to then slide 2, talk about Aristotle. Obviously a very important figure in the history of philosophy. We've referenced him numerous times throughout the course already, beginning with, lecture 1, when I went through the history of philosophy. I mentioned back then just how important not only Aristotle, but all those ancient philosophers were in general. Mentioned a moment ago, clearly is a very prolific writer. I just grabbed a handful of books in. I mentioned this in a previous video. I can't remember which video it was. It might have been the Epicurus video, another ancient thinker. But I think it was Epicurus, because we lose a lot of their writings. The older these guys are, obviously, the more likely it is we've lost their writings over time. And supposedly Aristotle, we've lost 80% of his original writings, which always blows my mind, because again, he's written so much. It seems like, just from what we still have, I can't imagine what he did besides write. So, he has a book on, I grab one, the metaphysics. He has the physics, right? Metaphysics, physics, rhetoric. I even have a dictionary for Aristotle because it's such a prolific writer. We even need a dictionary, the Aristotelian dictionary. And then, of course, Nicomachean Ethics. That's the book from which, the famous book, ethics book from which our excerpt was taken. Okay, so very, profound, prolific writer. I mentioned, well, it makes sense that he wrote so much. I think I mentioned way back in that intro lecture, the first lecture of the course, that Aristotle actually studied under Plato for like 20 years at least in Plato's academy, and he only finally leaves the academy after Plato dies. When I think Aristotle was like 38 or 40 years old or something like that, and then he goes off and forms his own school in philosophy known as the Lyceum. That was Aristotle's school, and I always thought it was interesting how different. And this gets at one of the points, actually the first bullet point I have on Aristotle here on slide 2. I always thought it was interesting how different Aristotle and Plato actually read. And you'll realize this when you read the excerpt for, what is it, lecture 15, when we read that excerpt from the Republic, how different Plato and Aristotle read, given that Aristotle was under Plato's tutelage for so long. It would seem like there would be a lot more similarities. And there are, similarities, don't get me wrong. That actually speaks to the first bullet point here. There is this academic debate amongst academics, scholars, people who spend their lives researching and studying Plato and researching and studying Aristotle. There is a debate amongst those sorts of scholars regarding the extent to which Aristotle actually offers his own novel and unique ideas, or the extent to which he does that versus kind of just regurgitating what Plato already said in slightly different ways. And so you have some Plato scholars who want to suggest that Plato, you don't really hear much that's new in Aristotle that you didn't already hear in some way in Plato. And of course, the Aristotelians, they want to say, no, that's not true. But it would make sense if there were some similarities, right? When the guy studied under Plato for so long. But for what it's worth, in my opinion, and I'm very familiar with both of them, and I think there's definitely palpable differences. I already mentioned how they read differently, right? Plato wrote an entirely dialogue form. It's like reading a story, whereas Aristotle writes in this more dry treatise style, right? This more typical philosophical style. It is interesting to point out that supposedly Aristotle did write dialogues himself, and those were just lost throughout history, which makes sense too. I always thought it was curious that we don't have any dialogues by Aristotle when, again, he studied under Plato for 20 plus years. So stylistically, again, going back to are they different? I would argue that they're definitely different stylistically, and the way they approach, the different things. I would say what's of utmost interest to them is different as well. Aristotle, for example, talks about logic and has monumental contributions to logic. More on that here in a moment. Whereas you don't really see Plato explicitly, at least not to the extent of Aristotle, addressing logic per se. So I'm of the opinion, obviously, that that they are doing, offering different things to us, right? That Aristotle is doing something unique. Obviously, he's going to be influenced by his mentor, by Plato, and then Plato's mentor, Socrates, to some extent, right? Through Plato. But I do think he's doing something new and unique and different. Okay. Oh yeah. So another fascinating sort of feature of Aristotle's life is towards the end of his life, he had to flee Athens because he actually tutored Alexander the Great when Alexander the Great was young, and then of course Alexander the Great subsequently goes on to conquer, many lands, including much of ancient Greece, which did not endear Aristotle's fellow Athenians to him, right? Because they knew of this connection Aristotle had to Alexander the Great, and so this led his fellow Athenians to condemn Aristotle, and so Aristotle flees at the end of his life, flees from Athens, exclaiming, quote, "I will not allow the Athenians to sin twice against philosophy." Now, what was their first sin? As we'll see in 2 lectures from now when we talk more about Plato and Socrates, we'll see that their first sin was killing Socrates, condemning him to death. And then it's always interesting comparing and juxtaposing Aristotle's reaction to Socrates, who famously says, you know, if this is what the state decides is correct, even though I think they're wrong, it's my duty or obligation to accept the penalty. He stays there, drinks the hemlock famously, and dies, whereas Aristotle says, no, you guys aren't getting away with this twice, and flees. So I mentioned, obviously, very prolific thinker and writer, monumental contributions, obviously, to ethics, as we've found out in our reading, but across the board as well. I mentioned logic a moment ago, so I still teach logic, intro to logic. I teach pretty much every semester, and what really stands out about Aristotle, I've mentioned this with respect to the ancients in a different video as well, but what really stands out about the ancients in general, particularly Aristotle. So a lot of these guys make monumental contributions, significant contributions, and they become famous for it, right? But what stands out about these ancients, and particularly Aristotle, is the long-lasting nature of these contributions. So I teach logic every semester, and a major part of the curriculum, a significant chunk of the curriculum, still stems from what Aristotle introduced 2,000 years ago. So it's still, not only did he make significant contributions at that point in time, but they were very long-lasting, right? They were still just as relevant to this day as they were back when he first made them. So one thing that stood out, again, not only about Aristotle, but a lot of the ancients in general. Okay, so that's Aristotle. Let's go ahead then and turn our attention to the idea of virtue ethics, the moral theory in general, and try to kind of start describing it and getting a handle on what kind of theory it is, and what does it emphasize. So Aristotle's moral theory is commonly referred to as virtue ethics. Okay, what does it emphasize? This is the most salient, important feature of virtue ethics. Okay, this emphasis on character or our habits, how we behave over time, and that's actually it's such an important point. This big picture point. This emphasis on how we behave over the long run, that it's going to warrant its own slide here in a little bit. And that's the degree to which that big picture emphasis of Aristotle, how important that is, that plays out even in here, right? This very idea of character. What's implied there is how we behave, not just now or in a moment, but how we tend to behave, right? Our pattern of behavior, our tendencies, if you will. And that's the point of emphasis. What type of you often hear it described as what type of person or people we become. That's the point of emphasis, as opposed to, as I mentioned in the middle of slide 3, emphasizing particular rules and principles like we found was the case in deontology, or rather than emphasizing the consequences that stem from our actions, as the utilitarians and consequentialists do. He's going to focus rather, as virtue ethicists do in general, on the idea of character, how we tend to behave over time. And our job, just to sort of spoil it for you, our job as moral agents for Aristotle is going to be, if we're exercising our rational capacity properly, and thus if we're going to make ourselves capable of reaching this state of flourishing and happiness, we're going to reflect on our habits and fine-tune our character in such a way that we better facilitate this our pursuit of eudaimonia, flourishing, a sustained sort of happiness. Okay, and what we're doing here for the rest of the lecture is really fleshing all of that out in more detail. Okay, so this is what matters. As the editors of our textbook suggest, virtue ethics focuses on, quote, what kinds of people we ought to be, and considers questions of what we ought and ought not to do based on the identification of morally desirable traits. And so you hear that a lot, character traits. Desirable traits or qualities of character, the virtues, end quote. So that's from 46. Okay, so turning to slide 4, a few general remarks about, again, trying to kind of carve out what the theory is like in general. So a few general remarks here. First, Aristotle, this is a very important point, as I mentioned at the very top of slide 4, he famously considers ethics a practical, that's important, it's practical science. Meaning it has to do with experience and what we're bringing about and action and doing, as I described here. So when I say for Aristotle and the virtue ethicists, doing matters in addition to reasoning. What I mean is, remember, I think maybe the best way to understand it is, remember, for Kant and the deontologists, it was almost as if the doing didn't matter at all. What happened in experience? So remember, we have like that arrow, here's an action. And what happened in experience after we reason and have a proper motive and intention, right? This is what matters for Kant, the reason that we engaged in, or the rational process we engaged in or didn't, right? And the motive and intention. That's all that mattered for him. Remember the whole points of like the second proposition of morality, for example. But none of this even mattered. Whatever transpired in experience doesn't seem to matter from a moral perspective. And here, Aristotle's saying, no, that's not true at all. Look, morality is a practical science. It has something to do with experience and wanting to bring about certain stuff in our experience. Okay, so it is a teleological moral view, like utilitarianism and consequentialism was. So remember, we talked about that at the very beginning of lecture 7. So the part 1 video for lecture 7, we talked about how utilitarianism is a teleological moral view. What matters is producing something, right? Bringing something about. It's future oriented. Okay, same thing for Aristotle. Morality, now reasoning does matter. Okay, this does matter. The point is, that's not enough though, right? It's not just, what matters is not reasoning just to be reasoning, right? We want to reason so as to bring about the sorts of things we want in our experience. Okay? Namely, we all want this flourishing existence for everyone, hopefully. So this is what we're ultimately aiming at. Okay? It's something to do with our experience. If one of these matters more, it would seem like it would be this one then, right? This is used to facilitate this, okay? So again, really the main point here is that Kant's wrong, the virtue ethicists would say. It's not just reasoning that matters morally. Okay? It does matter. As we'll see, it's our rational capacity for him that allows us, and I mentioned this a moment ago, right, to mold our character and reflect on those crappy habits we have, the ones we need to get rid of, like, don't drink 6 beers before you take a test. Every time I've taken a test before, the first 3 times or 4 times, I had a 6-pack and I failed the test. So fortunately, I have a rational capacity. It does matter, okay, for Aristotle. That's what allows us to reflect and think about these habits we have and realize, that's not working. It's not leading to a flourishing. Let's get rid of it. And instead, maybe let's just drink 1 beer or none. How about, right? Let's create a habit where we don't drink anything. Maybe water, right? 6 waters as we're taking or before we take the exam. We fine-tune our character through proper reasoning, okay? But ultimately, that's for the sake of reaching a state of eudaimonia. Okay? It's all for this, okay? So the doing matters. It's not just about the reasoning. Okay. He also makes an important point. Well, before I make that point, we should discuss the idea of politics and ethics briefly for Aristotle, and that's up here somewhere. My goodness. Wow, this is good. So there it is down there. If we just erase half the board, then we can see it more clearly, maybe. So the importance, here it is, of politics and ethics. So politics and ethics for Aristotle are intimately connected. They're intertwined. They're really like on the same spectrum. They're on the spectrum, and you might say, I guess politics is on this side. I mean, this kind of makes it look like they're on the opposite ends, but really the point is that they have a lot in common, really. The difference here is politics is dealing with a group of people, many people, whereas ethics is on the individual level. But he wants to say, for Aristotle, and that's why in his Politics, he has a book called Politics, you have a lot of moral points being made, and vice versa. And then you come back into ethics, you have a lot of political points being made, because they're very much one and the same. The only difference for him is the scope that they, the number of people they treat, more or less. So they're both aimed at the same thing. Spoiler alert, what he calls the supreme good. Eudaimonia, I said it right. Eudaimonia, however you want to say it. Okay, flourishing, a sustained happy existence. Both of these are aimed at facilitating that. Right? And so they're very much interconnected. The difference, again, is that ethics is more on an individual level, whereas politics is on a more general, group, social level, if you will. Okay, so he considers and talks about how political science and politics is the most authoritative and important science, and then so too, again, in saying that ethics, okay, because it determines what other sciences are necessary, right? What other ones we should allow within the state, if you will. But more importantly, right, politics and so too then ethics, right? They're concerned with knowledge of, as I mentioned a moment ago, the supreme good, what he calls the supreme good. That which we pursue, that's the end of all ends, which we pursue for its own sake, that which matters above all else. Okay? And what is that? Eudaimonia. Yes, did it again. Right? Of a sustained, flourishing, happy existence. Okay? Both of them are concerned with that. As he describes it on page 50 of our text, this idea of the supreme good. Quote, that which is always chosen for itself and never on account of something else. So turning to slide 5, let's flesh out this idea of the supreme good a little bit more, this idea of happiness, because it's very central to what Aristotle's talking about. And here we're going to see, obviously, we can sense already, I mentioned this at the beginning of this video, that there will be similarities to both at different times, right? Utilitarianism and then a deontology as well at different times. And this emphasis on happiness, eudaimonia, on the part of the virtue ethicist in Aristotle, it's very similar to obviously what matters to the utilitarians, happiness. So we're going to talk about eudaimonia. Old habits die hard, right? My habit, and this Aristotle would totally agree, it's a very pertinent point, right? My habit of pronouncing this incorrectly, apparently, you're going to see me struggle with it. Just like it speaks to the point, right, that we'll be making again and again, that this is it's a hard process getting here, and many times it's going to take trial and error, and many of us will never get there. And again, it's because we have, many of us, bad habits, and when we have those bad habits, saying words wrong or drinking too much or whatever the bad habits are, they're hard to break at times, and that's why, again, getting here can be so difficult. Not to mention saying the word can be so difficult. Okay, so I mentioned at the top of slide 5, right, that how it's typically translated. I already have tried to give you an idea of what this means. I mean, most generally, you could just say happiness. I would say typically it's more often translated flourishing. Right? To do well, to live well, all those work. Okay, and again, the idea is politics and ethics, moral philosophy, ethical philosophy. They're concerned with this. It has something to do with this, and that's what for Aristotle makes them so important. So obviously, this is a very important thing for Aristotle, as it was for the utilitarians. Now, Aristotle acknowledges there's a lot of this speaks to, again, his flexibility in his moral theory. Right? He's oftentimes flexible. He acknowledges that there's, and part of what makes morality in inexact science might be this, right? That we have different ideas of what happiness is, right? What does it mean to be happy? Well, you get different recipes from different people. And not only that, what makes me happy as an 18-year-old is going to be dramatically different from what makes me happy as a 38-year-old and a 58-year-old and a 70-year-old and so on. So Aristotle recognizes this, and this is one of the reasons then why he's going to suggest, I can't tell you what exactly you ought to do because we're different, and what's going to ultimately make us reach the state of eudaimonia or eudaimonia is, right, it's going to amount to different things depending on, you're going to have to take account of your own circumstances and that sort of thing, and it's going to vary. Now, granted, there are going to be certain things that are going to be similar, like going out and killing people, being a serial killer. It doesn't matter who you are. That's probably not going to be a habit conducive to this. Okay, but the point is, he recognizes that the recipe for this is not only going to be different across people, but across the time within one person's own existence. It can vary. Okay, so. He mentions that there are like 3 general types or views of what happiness amounts to, for example. Is it just pleasure? Is that all it is? I think like this very animalistic sort of hedonistic view, not a Epicurean, say, a properly understood Epicurean view, but rather like, it's all about just the animal pleasures. Okay. That's typically called the ordinary or vulgar view in philosophical circles, but that's one view. That's what happiness looks like for for some of us and maybe many of us, right? It revolves around basic pleasures, or what Mill might refer to, let's say, as a lower quality pleasure. Okay. How about honor? Does that matter? Well, for some people, Aristotle points out, yeah, it seems to matter. Energetic people, more cultivated people, he says, right, at the end of the political life, so people that entertain political careers are typically, right, they're not going to be happy with just this, right? They're going to need some degree of honor involved as well, he suggests. And then there are some people for whom, these won't suffice, or maybe this isn't necessary, this is necessary, but then also this, right? So different things will matter for different people, right? But what about, how do I want to put this? The intellectual life. So feeding, this might be, if we're, reflecting back on the Mill lecture, utilitarianism lecture, higher quality pleasures, feeding those, that matters. Mill would argue for a lot of people, right? And Aristotle's acknowledging that there's many people for whom this isn't going to be enough, or some combination of these isn't going to be enough. They're going to need to feed that intellectual curiosity, to read some books and so on and so forth. Right? They're going to need some sort of life of thought involved. So there's all these different versions of what happiness can look like. But he wants to say, regardless, turning to slide 6, what we're all ultimately aiming for is best captured by this idea, this notion of happiness. Granted, it might look a little bit different, and so for him, he says, eudaimonia. Eudaimonia. I wonder if somebody's keeping track, keeping score at home. How many times I've said it correctly versus how many times I've said it incorrectly. Regardless, right, of what our particular version of that looks like, this is what ultimately matters. That best captures what we're all after, okay, in some shape or form. So that's what I'm getting at top of 50 when I quote him. This is at top of slide 6 when I quote him on page 50 of the text. The supreme good, eudaimonia, is, quote, that which is always chosen for itself and never on account of something else. Happiness, above all, seems to be of this character, for we always choose it on account of itself and never on account of something else. So everything else, and again, this sounds very similar to what Bentham and Mill told us, and Epicurus for that matter. Everything else, pleasure, honor, intelligence, and even virtue is desired partly for its own sake, quote, but we choose them also for the sake of happiness, end quote. So that's, again, from page 50. And again, the idea is this is the end, right? We don't pursue this to then get something else. Just as the utilitarian suggested, this is the end. This is what we're ultimately aiming after. Okay? No one desires happiness as a means to something else, is the point. So on 51, in sum, quote, happiness appears to be something complete and self-sufficient, it being an end of our actions, end quote. Okay, so to get a better idea of what exactly happiness is going to look like for us, or eudaimonia is what that's going to look like for us as human beings, he suggests let's take a look at our function. So you get a lot of function talk from Aristotle. We mentioned the idea of telos. I think that's another word I always say wrong. Telos, I think it's supposed to be telos. That means, remember, teleology, a teleological view like utilitarianism and virtue ethics, right? It's aimed at securing something down the road. Okay? Now, so it's aimed at getting something down the road. So in general, right, both those theories are saying we're going after happiness. Okay? So this is then related to his idea of function. Everything has a function, and then his related idea of, or concept of virtue, okay, or what it means to be virtuous. And it makes sense for us to talk a little bit about that, right? Because this is called virtue ethics. So what exactly does the idea of virtue even mean, or being virtuous mean? So all of this relates to this Greek term telos or telos, this idea of Aristotle's, this emphasis he has that this notion that everything has an end that it's pursuing. It's kind of reminiscent of Aquinas. Remember, Aquinas is very influenced by Aristotle. The idea that everything has an end, it's directed towards something. And so, right, what he's going to talk about then is, what is the end or function of human beings? Okay, so that's what we're going to look at turning to slide 7. So to get an idea of, what that is for us, he wants to say, we want to know what the proper function of a human being is. So that's important. Human being. So whatever the function is, or the purpose we spell out is, it better pick out something that's special or unique to human being, right? We don't want to know what the function is of being in general, but rather specifically, what is the function or purpose of a human being? Okay, and so he says it's not life or living in general. Okay, because we have that in common with everything that's alive, obviously plants and other animals and so on. It's not like a life of sensation. Again, we have that in common with other animals. Okay, so he says, well, what's left? What's uniquely human? What do all these philosophers seem to point to that matters when they go through these theories? What is it? What is it? What is it? Reason. That's what matters. We have this rational capacity, this ability to reflect, to think, to perceive and mull over things. So as he says on 51 of the text, quote, there remains a certain active life of that which possesses reason. Quote, the work of a human being, so what's uniquely human, the function or work, the task we have, the end for us, is an activity of soul in accord with reason, or not without reason. So our function then is going to require us to properly utilize what's unique to us, right? That rational capacity. So turning then to slide 8, this then, once we flesh out what our function or job or work or goal or purpose is, okay, well then we're in a position to speak to this idea of virtue, because what virtue is for Aristotle is it's just performing your function well, doing your job well, right? Fulfilling that end that you were meant to pursue. And we should point out in this ancient era, it had a much wider connotation than it does nowadays. So typically nowadays, when we hear of virtue, we immediately associate it with moral behavior on the part of human beings, right? But back in his ancient era, that had a much wider connotation. So you could speak of anything that had a function could be virtuous if it performed its function well. So a marker has a function, right? To be able to be seen when I try to use it so that you can see it. And I have many, so that the opposite would be vicious, right? Right, so virtue, and then the opposite is vice. So if you were wondering, you heard vicious, it's a virtuous or vicious, okay? That's the opposite. So if you don't perform your function well, your job, you don't fulfill what it was you were set out to do, you're a marker and you don't write well, then you're vicious. You're not virtuous, you're vicious. You don't fulfill your purpose. Right? And so I want to make that point that has a much wider connotation. But then applying that back to human being, he wants to say, we come kind of full circle, he wants to say that, look, for human beings, what it's going to mean to be virtuous, okay, is it's going to mean we are happy, okay, and that's going to require the proper utilization of our rational capacity, what was unique to us. So again, what is our function or our purpose? It's going to be to reach the state of eudaimonia through the utilization of what's unique to us, our rational capacity. So we're not going to get here, right, without properly utilizing this. Right? And so who are the virtuous human beings? Those that are happy. And again, the big picture point is relevant here. It's not just, you're happy on a Friday night. No, it's in a sustained sort of sense, okay? So again, the virtuous human being, who are the morally praiseworthy people for Aristotle? Those who have reached the state of eudaimonia, who have, again, they're not happy just in one moment or two moments, but who are happy in the sustained sort of way. And that would only be possible. It's only possible through the proper rational reflection. And that's why, and it's very, very difficult process, and one that very few people ever get to. At least that's the implication here. Okay. So ultimately, happiness or the human good is, quote, an activity of soul in accord with virtue. And I was just mentioning this, literally just said this, turning to slide 9, that point about the big picture. It's so important, it's so big. Let's write it with big letters. It's almost like if you want to just take one point about Aristotle's theory that captures it more than these other theories. It would be this, right? It's emphasis on, again, happiness in a sustained sort of way. It's not good enough to be happy in the moment or for a few hours or for even a few weeks. We're talking happy over a prolonged period of time. Now, that's not to say you're not going to experience little dips here and there too, but on a whole, over time, you're happy. And he constantly implies that this is a very difficult process to get there, and it's not something we have automatically or that we're born with, he's going to point out. Rather, to reach this state of eudaimonia, and it's going to take a lot of trial and error, a lot of practice on our part. So, again, all of this goes to point to this underlying emphasis on the big picture. We have to have an eye towards the big picture when we assess people, right? We don't want to, again, not only is it not what matters, happiness in the moment, but also when we assess people, one of the implications is, with this point of the big picture, that we don't want just a snapshot view of them, right? We don't want to isolate just one action. To truly get a proper gauge of what kind of person they are, what matters morally for Aristotle, we need a wider purview. We need a view of how they behave over time, not just in an isolated incident here or there. That's why, as I'll mention in the part 2 video, when we talk about one of the criticisms, you hear of character witnesses in courts of law. What are they doing? They're saying, hey, this one time he or she acted like this, that was the exception. How they tend to act over time, that's an Aristotelian point. Captures that idea, that emphasis on character. How they tend to act over time is totally different than what they did in this very egregious moment. Okay? That sort of witness, character witness, that's, again, an emphasis on character, how we behave over time. That is a very Aristotelian sort of point. Okay? And so I mentioned slide 9, really trying to make that point. And so I quote him on 52 of our text where he's basically making this point. He says, quote, but in addition, in a complete life, so what matters is eudaimonia, or flourishing, not in a moment, right, but in a complete life. For one swallow does not make a spring, nor does one day. And in this way, one day or a short time does not make someone blessed and happy either, end quote. Okay? So anyone could be happy for a few minutes, for a weekend, for a week, for a month, but eudaimonia, if you've really, truly reached that state, you're happy in this sustained sort of way over a long period of time. Not to suggest you don't have any dips occasionally, but all in all, on a whole, okay, you're happy. Okay. So Aristotle, how we kind of have this idea of virtue, and he talks about intellectual moral virtues and distinguishes these different types of virtue. We're just going to focus in on moral virtue and what that looks like. And so we know that the virtuous person is going to have something to do with being happy, and that's going to require proper rational reflection. But Aristotle, tell me a little bit more, what exactly does it look like to be morally virtuous, or what does moral virtue amount to? And so we'll speak to that. We're now turning to slide 10. So just keep in mind when I say virtue, I'm just talking about his idea of moral virtue here. So again, we're talking about virtue. Again, it's not something we have naturally. So rather than having it by nature, no, we don't have it. It's not something like eyesight that we're born with. Rather, it's more like an art, right? That we have to, or an instrument that we have to practice. Okay? It's something, hence, not something we have by nature. Rather, what matters is habit, right? How we behave over time. It has something to do habits or behaviors over time. Okay? So that's what he's getting at when he says on page 54 of our text, quote, none of the moral virtues are present in us by nature. The virtues we come to have by engaging in the activities first, as is the case with the arts, end quote. And, I think one of the points he's making there is, we have to live our experience and live it out, so to speak, to kind of figure out life, so to speak, to figure out what works. And it's not something we're just born with, this knowledge immediately and these habits that elicit this. No, this is something we're going to have to work at through trial and error, and through reflecting again and molding our habits in a way that get us here. Okay, it's not something like eyesight that we have, but insofar as it would be rather like learning and playing the guitar, right? Insofar as we ever get any good at it, insofar as we ever get here, okay, it was going to take a lot of trial and error and focusing and reflecting on our habits, okay, and fine-tuning those over time. Okay, he also makes the point, this is the bottom of slide 10, and we will reiterate this as we proceed here. He says, quote, as a result of and on account of the same things, every virtue both comes into being and is destroyed. I might go ahead and put this up here. So what he's getting at here is basically the idea that it's the same thing that solicits both virtue and vice. Right? It's the same thing, namely doing the whatever type of action we're talking about, doing it in moderation, doing it at the appropriate times, not doing it too much, and not doing it too little. Okay, that's what it's going to amount to. So the same thing. So the example we're going to use quite often is acting fearlessly. So the same thing, and the particular example we're using, let's say acting fearlessly, yields both the virtue if done in moderation, but also yields the vices, related vices then if it's done either too much or too little. So that's what he's getting at when he says, as a result of and on account of the same things, every virtue both comes into being and is destroyed. Okay? It's through the same sorts of actions, and name specifically the degree to which you do them and whether you do them in moderation, that either the virtue comes about or instead it's destroyed and the related vices come about. So let me flesh this out because this is probably not making a whole lot of sense yet. Acting fearlessly is our specific example. I'll give you real quick. So speaking to that point about the same thing, both produces and destroys virtue, right? Or produces virtue and the vices. It's just as playing the guitar yields both, guitar gods like Jimi Hendrix and the guitar wannabes or duds like myself. The idea is by doing things in our interactions with human beings, some of us become just, others unjust. End quote. That's on 55. So what is he getting at here? So the idea is, with respect, every type of action, there's a related virtue, which is when you do it in moderation. Okay. Hopefully you can hit that target, also known as the golden mean. Okay. But oftentimes we miss it. Okay. So I'm giving you a specific type of action or a specific example here. Okay. Now, if we hit the moderate amount of acting fearlessly, that would be being courageous or brave, he would say. Okay. But it's the same thing, acting fearlessly, if we do it too much, that will then yield, so this would be a vice, in this case, excess. And we would say you're foolhardy, and we'll elaborate on this in a couple slides. Foolhardy or rash, you might say. Okay. Or alternatively, I'm going to go ahead and erase this. If you don't do this enough, so you don't hit the moderate amount because you are deficient, hopefully I spelled that right, then you are said to be cowardly in this specific example. Okay. So I know that didn't make sense at first probably, but hopefully now you can see what he's getting at. The same thing, okay, same type of action yields both the virtue and destroys it, right, or yields the corresponding vices. Whoops. And yields corresponding vices depending on the degree to which you engage in that type of action. Okay, so every type of action, kind of break it down like this, every type of action has a corresponding vice and then corresponding virtue and then two corresponding vices. And he's saying the same sort of thing, all right, these types of actions will yield both the virtue and the corresponding vices. And that's the point that we were getting at. I'm all over the place here, getting at the bottom of slide 10. Okay. But before, so this is getting at the golden mean, right? And we talked about sort of this general idea of virtue. Aristotle, I want to know, again, how to become virtuous, right? I know you tell me that it's going to take trial and error, that it takes work, but what do I do? And one of the things, some of the critics have an issue with is that, there doesn't seem to be enough guidance on Aristotle's Aristotle's part, right? That it's, and he does suggest it's an inexact science. Moving on, to slide 11, right? That's one of the things people find appealing about Aristotle's moral theory, that it is not as strict, right, and absolute as, say, Kant or even the utilitarians. You always ought to do whatever promotes the greatest happiness for the greatest number, period, right? It's much more flexible, Aristotle's moral view is. But then the flip side of that, right, is that some people have concerns that it's not offering us enough guidance then. And so, skipping ahead to slide 12, in a moment we'll talk about how actually he still does give us some guidance, right? But yeah, they're gonna suggest, well, look, you're not offering enough guidance. Especially that seems to be problematic when, as Aristotle says, you're going to leave it up to each individual to sort of figure out what's best for them. When, as we'll see, Aristotle points out that if we're not living a virtuous life, but rather if we have all kinds of bad habits, our perspective's tainted, and so we don't see virtue for what it is. Well, then how can you leave it up to individuals to have to figure out what's best for them if you admit and acknowledge that they're so corrupted by vice, right? How are we ever going to be able to self-correct, right? Yet that seems to be the prescription here. Is it's not an exact science, and I can't tell you exactly what to do. So that I'm getting at, one of the issues that people have, right? That's ironically also one of the things, as I began by pointing out, that was appealing to some people. That's the issue for some other people, right? So some people like this flexibility, a lot different than what we got with Kant and the utilitarians even. But then again, that's going to be an issue for some people. So let's go back and establish, so slide 11 here, the sense in which he thinks it is an inexact science. Look, this morality business, what you ought to do. We know it's going to entail some degree of rational reflection, but as we've been saying, this isn't something that's one and the same. This state of eudaimonia, I knew I shouldn't have erased it. That's not the route to get there is not one and the same for anybody. And it's not even the same, as I tried to demonstrate earlier, not even the same across one person's own lifetime, right? The lifespan of one person is the recipe for this, or how we ought to try to go about getting there, or the types of habits that are most conducive to this, those might fluctuate and change, evolve. And so, again, Aristotle is definitely going to make this point. He wants to say, so he says, this is 56, quote, every argument concerned with what ought to be done is bound to be stated in outline only and not precisely. Matters of action and those pertaining to what is advantageous have nothing stationary about them, just as matters of health do not either, end quote. So that's 56. So he wants to draw the analogy to, you go into the doctor's office because you're not feeling well. The doctor doesn't have a pre-made prescription ready for everybody that comes in, and Aristotle's making the same point with respect to moral agents. Okay, just like every patient's different, and the doctor has to analyze the particular patient's circumstances, so too every moral agent is different, and what will lead to eudaimonia is going to require proper rational reflection and something probably different for each of these people. Okay? So the prescription for what they ought to do, the types of habits that are conducive to this, a lot of them will be the same, right? Again, you can't go around killing people and so on and so forth. But the particulars, those are going to change depending on the person. Okay? So naturally, as I've been mentioning, right, as the point at the bottom of the slide 11 here, totally different than the deontologist moral perspective, or someone like Kant, even the utilitarians. Okay, seems to be different than those moral views. So particular moral dilemmas do not, quote, fall under an art or any set of precepts. Instead, those who act ought themselves always to examine what pertains to the opportune moment, as is the case with both medicine and piloting. All right, so let's then go ahead and turn to slide 12 and talk about this some more, right? So actually, let me put this here. So we're talking about this famous golden mean, the idea of the golden mean. And I referenced this at the very beginning of the video, how so many of us have this notion, we've heard this notion, moderation is the key. Well, that stems from Aristotle. Good grief. The golden mean. That stems from Aristotle and his idea of the golden mean and what he was emphasizing thousands of years ago. It's going to bug me if I don't change that. There we go. The golden mean. Okay, and so we've tried to capture that there. So I've articulated one of the concerns on the part of some of the critics. This flexibility that's oftentimes lauded on the part of Aristotle enthusiasts. We don't like that, right? It's too loosey-goosey. There's not enough moral guidance here, right? You're saying it's inexact will help us, right? What do we do? And so, to his credit, Aristotle doesn't completely leave us hanging, and we'll elaborate on some practical tips in the second part of the lecture, in the second video. But we'll conclude here by discussing this golden mean, which is a general tip, the general guidance, which has lasted for thousands of years. And again, it's that idea of moderation being the key. I don't care who you are, what your circumstances are. So granted, let me back up 1 minute. So 1 moment. So remember this idea of acting fearlessly. Okay, the idea of moderation, right? The moderate amount of acting fearlessly, that could change. Again, why morality is not an exact science. The degree to which you're required to act fearlessly, that could vary depending on your circumstances, obviously, right? So the amount you need to act fearlessly is going to be a lot more if you're a soldier fighting in a war versus a student, just watching Dr. Musil's videos. You're going to be required to hit that golden mean. You're going to be required as a soldier to act fearlessly far more often. And that's the sense in which, again, he can't tell us exactly what to do. Right? I can't tell you exactly when and where and how often to act fearlessly because it totally depends on your circumstances, okay, and whether you're fighting in a war or not, and so on and so forth. Okay, so the soldier is going to be required to act fearlessly a lot more often than an average Joe Blow who's not fighting in a war. Okay, so it varies. So then going to the golden mean, regardless though of who you are, what your circumstances are, Aristotle's going to say, there's always the sense in which you can do whatever it is you're doing too much, hence excess. That's a problem, vice. Okay, and there's always a sense in which you can do it too little, not enough, deficiency, another vice, and two related vices. And granted, ideally, you hit, right? Alternatively, and ideally, you hit the golden mean, right? The moderate amount of whatever it is we're talking about. In which case, you'd hit the virtue, the corresponding virtue. Okay, so he does give us advice. He does give us something with which to work. Granted, it's an inexact sort of thing. You'll have to take note of your circumstances. Are you fighting in a war or not? But regardless of that, even if you are fighting in the war, there's still a sense in which you can act fearlessly too much. Okay, even if you're fighting in a war, if you're kamikaze Rambo dude who goes out from behind cover on day one and gets mowed down, you're acting fearlessly too much, even though you are a soldier. So even a soldier can act fearlessly too much, and then obviously having a coward in the battlefield is not what we want. So again, and obviously Joe Blows, right? Average Joe Blow, they can act fearlessly too much or too little. So no matter who you are, what your circumstances are, there's always a sense in which you can do whatever we're talking about, too much or too little. Okay. So the virtues are, quote, naturally destroyed through deficiency and excess, end quote. This is getting at this idea of the golden mean. So all moral virtues reflect some kind of golden mean, which falls somewhere in between those two extremes. One in excess, the other in deficiency. So you can think about all kinds of examples. Food intake, too much, that's a problem. Obesity, too little, that's a problem. Right? Malnourished. Okay, they're both an issue. And the proper amount of food intake, well, that's going to vary, again, depending on your circumstances. Are you an Olympic athlete in the middle of training, or are you just an average Joe Blow? Well, you might need to eat, have more food intake if you're an Olympic athlete that's burning tons of calories every day. Okay, so it can fluctuate. It's not an exact thing. But still, even for the Olympic athlete, you can eat too much, right? Even though the proper or moderate amount for you is more than the average Joe Blow, there's still a sense in which you can eat too much. Okay. Acting fearlessly, we talked about that one. Obviously, that's the one we're really hammering home here. That's the one that he picks up on quite a bit. So that's why I put that one up here. So again, we mentioned this point with respect to the guitar playing, so this is a few slides ago. But the same thing, this is the point at the bottom here. The same thing, in this case acting fearlessly, is yielding both the corresponding virtue and the corresponding vices. I think then that's where I want to end this first part, our first lecture, our first part of the lecture, and we'll pick up then with part 2. We'll talk about, again, some of the practical implications of all this stuff that he said, and some more practical tips that he's going to offer us. We're going to talk a little bit about how to identify again that who truly has a morally virtuous character. He's going to make some very Kantian points about judging little Sammy helping the little lady cross the street. Does little Sammy have a virtuous character? We have to know a few things. We'll talk more about that, and then the idea of moral responsibility and how to go about praising and blaming people. You know, given this virtue ethics position or general moral framework, how do we go about locating moral responsibility and then praising and blaming people for what they've done? And we'll elaborate on a few criticisms as well. You know, given, for example, one that I really like, drawing on character witnesses example, the one I really like is, you know, what do we do in cases where the way somebody acts 99% of their life is totally at odds with how they act in one moment? Can there be Aristotle? Can there be something that's so egregious in the moment that it offsets how this person behaved the rest of their life? Again, he wants to seem to suggest that what matters is how they behave over time, and so that snapshot seems to be the exception, and we ought to throw that out. We'll try telling that to, you know, the victims of the people that were murdered in this, you know, 1 second snap decision to kill 10 people, right? And normally this person's a saint, but for whatever reason they snapped in that moment and killed 10 people. You know, do we still deem them a saint because 99% of their life they acted in this saintly manner? We'll pick up on that criticism and a couple others as well towards the end of the second part. For now, though, we'll end part 1. I'll leave you with the intermission questions, which you can address if you'd like, or you can wait and discuss one of the reflection time questions at the end. Do you like Aristotle's emphasis on behavior over time and these habits and this idea of character, as opposed to, you know, principles and rules like the deontologist emphasized, and as opposed to consequences and what follows from actions? That's what mattered for the consequentialists, the utilitarians. Do you like Aristotle's focus on this idea of character, habits, behavior over time? And what about this idea of morality being inexact? Do you find that appealing, or do you share some of the concerns some people have that in suggesting it's inexact, we fail to offer enough guidance? So what are your feelings on this notion that morality is inexact? Do you like that idea that what might be morally required for me might not be morally required for you? What will make me happy might not be exactly the same as what will make you happy. Now, again, I would insist on keeping in mind that there are some habits that are going to have to be the same across the board, right? That are going to have to be in place to reach eudaimonia. For example, not killing lots of people routinely. That's not a good idea, because you'll probably find yourself being killed in return. Granted, that's the case. There are going to be some habits that are seen across the board, across all people, that are necessary to reach this sustained state of flourishing. Do you agree that, granted that a lot of what might make us happy does fluctuate and does change across people? Do you like that idea? And because that's what matters, then reaching this sustained sort of happy existence, since that's what matters, and because getting there can differ by person, then morality is different for different people. Do you like that idea? So that's what question 2 is getting at. Okay, well, that wraps it up until part 2. Good luck wrestling with this and figuring part 1 material out. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.